So, and I have a button. That's me. Also with Solutions for Urban Agriculture, we're going to talk about both of those things, some of my background, Solutions for Urban Ag, Seeds of Hope, some other stuff I've done. Just by way of getting to know each other a tiny bit, who here is involved in some way in the world of food? All right. Apart from consumption, more on the production side, anybody come from the world of farming in particular? Any kind of farming counts. Are you in? All right. Good, 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 good. And how many people here are actually from Long Beach? Hey, you always come with a qualifier. You don't have to be originally from here. You don't have to be born here. Okay. All right, thank you. So a tiny bit about my background. I'm actually, this only dawned on me within the last year. I'm a 5th generation Los Angeles County farmer, which is really weird because there haven't been a lot of farmers here in a while, but some of us are here, we're back, it's cool. But I had family on both sides. My dad's mom's side, they all came from New England around the time of statehood in the dairy business. My dad's dad grew up in Long Beach. They moved out here from Iowa 115 years ago. His dad was a butcher, had a butcher shop over on 5th and Pine, I believe. And they were 4. My grandfather was 4 when they moved here. Did I say that wrong? You're scowling at me like I don't know my Long Beach geography, which it's probably true. She's gonna, I have no idea where the butcher shop really was. I think it was there. Anyway, my grandfather grew up here from the time he was 4. He actually decided after, we were talking about this at dinner, I have no idea the logical progression here, but he spent a year in high school, one summer, working on a farm in the Imperial Valley and decided, I want to be a farmer. I don't know how that works because I've been to the Imperial Valley on the farm in summer. But he wanted to be a farmer. His mother didn't like the idea. She thought that was a step backwards. We have left the farm. We've come to the city, and your father has a respectable business. And so they had that conversation of, well, okay, how about if you go to college, then you'll have something to fall back on. So he went to the University of California and graduated from the first class of their agricultural school, which was at the school farm in Davis, because of course UC was one place in Berkeley. And that was 1920. So we'll get into that. So that's a little bit of my background. Oh, we didn't get to me. So my dad was a farmer, my uncle was a farmer, my cousin's a farmer. I grew up on a farm, said I would never do it. Here I am talking to you about how we're going to do it for the rest of all future. We'll get into some of that in a minute. So this is a good place to start. We start talking about agricultural innovation. Believe it or not, this is exactly the direct result of agricultural innovation because NASA estimates it took 400,000 people to put a man on the moon. That's 400,000 people that didn't have to work on a farm to feed themselves or their family. They were freed up to do all these other things. So really, every technological advance is made possible by agricultural innovation because people could go do other things than have to sit around feeding themselves. Before the Industrial Revolution, 90% of the workforce in the United States was on the farm. Basically, everybody was feeding themselves. By the end of the Industrial Revolution, that's my grandfather. That's right over on Pioneer Boulevard, basically Pioneer and Del Amo in what is now Lakewood. So by the end of the Industrial Revolution, there were now 27% of the labor force was involved in farming. That's the world that my grandfather farmed in. There's some agricultural innovation such as that was his first mechanical harvester, pulled by horses, as you can see, because my grandfather, although tractors were around and becoming more common, he didn't actually buy a tractor until the 1950s because he was stubborn and because this is the way we've always done it, and because tractors are bad for the soil. They're just going to compact the field and, besides he had my dad, my uncle, and horses. So by the time my dad was farming in the, well, from the 50s, he started with his dad, but really the 60s and 70s was the height of his career. At that point, the time referred to as the Green Revolution, just a little over 4.5% was now involved in farming. The Green Revolution, for those of you who don't know, was this time between the 1950s and 1960s where we had the advent of fertilizers, plant breeding programs, irrigation technology, all these things that boosted crop yields dramatically to the point that the gentleman largely credited with the whole Green Revolution thing, Norman Borlaug, thank you, won a Nobel Prize for his work in this area. Ironically, interestingly, all the innovations that made up the Green Revolution, he was credited with saving the lives of 1 billion people, they say, who might otherwise have died of starvation were it not for these advances, and also improving the economies of developing countries. Interestingly, we're in a time now where all of those innovations are now in question based on a different set of criteria. The criteria then was how do we keep people from starving to death? Now that there's not a lot of that going on, there's concern about, well, what did all of these advances do to the physical environment that we have to work in? As of now, this is a 2012 number, farmers make up only 1.5% of the workforce. And the average age of a farmer is 59. I don't know how old this guy is, but it's like, I Googled old farmer. It's like, that'll do. Because that's pretty much what they all look like. I say they because I don't want to put myself in that category because I'm still quite young, as you can see. Actually, I'm reaching the average age of, okay, I'm 57. I'm a young farmer. I am below the average age, so I'm still young. But you begin to see the progression here and the scope of the problem. As we talk about adding another couple of billion of mouths to feed, the really good question is who's going to do that, and where's that innovation going to come from? Obviously, we have to start, innovation starts with knowledge and understanding. In order to move something forward, you have to understand the thing it is that you're working with. There's 3 categories of knowledge as I see it. Basically, there's the stuff we know, which isn't as much as we would like to think. There's the stuff we don't know, which is a nearly infinite category. And there's the stuff we don't even know that we don't know, and that's the most dangerous category because that's where hubris is born. Although I was having lunch with some folks today, and it occurred to me, as we were talking about a number of things, that really the ignorance is a prerequisite to innovation. If it weren't for ignorance, most of the great businesses in the world would not have started because the people starting them would have recognized how impossible it was and they wouldn't have set out to try. I have a bit of that experience myself. But this is really important when we talk about ag innovation, is knowing what we're talking about. Because some things that seem intuitively obvious just aren't. The best example I can think of is you may know, for forever and ever and ever and ever, everybody knew that stomach ulcers are caused by excess stomach acid, because that's obvious, right? You got too much acid in your stomach and it burns a hole in your stomach, you get an ulcer. Except now we know that's not true. Nobody was doing medical research into stomach ulcers because why would you? Everybody knows that. When there was some guy, some doctor, a general practitioner down in Australia who came up with the idea that it was actually a bacteria. Well, that's crazy, you're not a specialist, you're not a researcher, you're a general practitioner, you're crazy, and there's no money for that research, and by the way, you're crazy. So fast forward, turns out he wasn't crazy, he was right, everybody else was wrong, and the intuitively obvious thing just wasn't true. And, but to be reliable, intuition has to be rooted in knowledge and experience. We have to know what we're talking about. Without knowledge or experience, we're relying on our own imagination, and intuition rooted in imagination is pure fantasy. And I say all of this to say that this is what I sort of discovered when I found myself one day in a category of something called urban farmer. I didn't know that was a thing, but apparently I was doing it. And because I'm old, not that old, still a young farmer, not quite average age yet, and had come from the world of traditional farming, a lot of the urban ag folks in LA kind of decided that I knew stuff, which was weird. But what I found was that there's a whole group of folks now who are coming into this effort to want to try to feed people, want to try to do it in a better way, a more conscientious way, and they're filled with passion and utterly devoid of experience or training. And sometimes it lands in this territory, where you get a group of people in a room who don't really know anything, but it's sort of like if there's enough of us who don't know anything, and we all get in a room together and start talking, somehow knowledge will spontaneously combust. Doesn't work that way. The prerequisite to innovation is understanding the challenge, okay? And each challenge presents an opportunity. That's the other side, that's the yin to the yang of a problem, of a challenge, is that it creates opportunity. And so the most important thing before we innovate is to understand what's the problem we're trying to solve. The secret to innovation is asking the right questions. This is where knowledge comes in. So the question is, what's the most limiting factor? Oops, let me go back here. This is something I learned in my business for 20 plus years. I had a business based around some technology that we developed to stabilize soil structure. So wonderful technology. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute. But what I learned along the way is you can have a miracle invention that can actually perform the miracle it was designed to perform. And it may not solve the problem that you think you're solving, because the problem that you're addressing may not have the cause that you think it has. So, for instance, let's say there's a guy, he's got a boat. He gets in his boat to go across the river. He gets halfway across, the boat sinks. Pulls the boat up, pulls it back, tries to figure out what's wrong. A guy comes by and says, hey, I'm an oar salesman. What you need is a set of oars. These things are amazing. Put them on the boat. You can row across and you won't sink. He pulls out research on oars and the effectiveness of rowing a boat versus other methods of propulsion or just standing still sinking. It's impressive. Charts and graphs, the whole thing. So he buys the oars. Paddles the boat, halfway across, sinks. Pulls it out, gets it back. About that time, a guy comes along. He says, you know, I sell sails. Sails are the way to go. Same thing. Charts and graphs, it's amazing. Sails are the modern technology. Let's put a mast, let's put a sail, go across, the thing sinks. All right, now he's really getting tired of this. About this time, this guy comes by and says, your problem is you're using all this antiquated technology. I don't care how good it used to be. What you need is an engine. You need a 350 Chevy with headers on it, put it on here, no transmission, direct the prop, just throttle it, go, and you'll get across, and you'll be fine. Fired it up, gunned it, gets halfway across in no time and sinks. Turns out he had a hole in the boat. None of those technologies, as awesome as they were ever going to solve the problem, because we're asking the wrong question. The first question is, what is identifying the problem and the cause of the problem to be able to understand what the challenge truly is. So farmers as innovators are a wonderful place to start. They have invaluable experience and perspective. They've been doing this forever. They really understand the situation, they understand the challenges, but there's a bit of the can't see the forest for the trees syndrome. Sometimes we can get stuck in, this is the way we do it because this is the way we've always done it, and we've always done it this way because that's the way it's done. And it's always worked, and so sometimes it's hard to come at a new problem in a new way. We may come at a new problem in the same old way that we've come at the old problems, and it may not be effective. So what about non-farmers as innovators? Well, you get fresh eyes with no limiting preconceptions, which is wonderful. But then there's that lack of relevant experience and expertise. So all of these problems are deep and plentiful, and they're going to require lots of perspective. And they're going to require the perspective that comes from experience, and they're going to require the perspective that comes from way outside of that box. Necessity is the mother of innovation, he says. So let's talk a little about what innovation looks like. This, by the way, is Eiji Kawamura. He's the chair of Solutions for Urban Agriculture, where he and I worked together on that project, along with some other cool guys. And I shouldn't say that. Wonderful people, because they're not all of the male gender, which guys infers, so I apologize. Eiji is, he was he's a third-generation California farmer. He was the Secretary of Agriculture for the state of California for quite a number of years, and he's back in the family business now. And what's behind him is in this picture, is some of the stuff that we're working on with Solutions for Urban Agriculture, testing and playing with and exploring new technologies for growing food in small, tight urban spaces. Oh yeah. So let me just tell you a little bit, just a couple examples of some of what innovation looks like. And I'll start with Eiji. Eiji is, like I said, third-generation farmer. His family's farmed here long before there were, this was an urban area. They're still farming here, and so now he's what I call an accidental urban farmer because everything got swallowed up around him. They still farm about 1,000 acres of traditional scale agriculture, but it's all sort of tucked in odd spaces here, there, and wherever around Orange County and LA County. And actually, is Chino LA County, or is that? I don't know. That's what I thought. It's Riverside County. So at least 3 counties around here. They've got stuff in other areas. But as everything changed, they learned how to change with it. Farming on vacant lots, farming on, they farm out at the SEAL Weapons Naval Weapons Depot, wherever you can be. And constantly looking at new technologies. And that's a part of how Solutions for Urban Ag came about. Years ago, almost 30 years ago now, Eiji started a relationship with Second Harvest Food Bank, allowing them to come out and glean from his fields at the end of harvest so that they could take and make use of some of that stuff. That grew into him just planting a portion of each field directly for them. That turned into a nonprofit called, at the time, Orange County Harvest, which later became Solutions for Urban Ag. We're a direct farm to food bank farming operation. After he came back from his time in Sacramento, we talked about reviving the nonprofit and expanding the mission, and recognizing that there's this group of young folks who want to become farmers who don't have any idea how to do that, and that we have the opportunity to share some of that knowledge. We created Solutions for Urban Ag, which provides that kind of training. In terms of innovation, though, I'm going to give you just a tiny bit of my own experience with agricultural innovation. I had a business for 20 plus years called Aggregator. It still exists. I sold the business. Those folks did well and sold it again, so I'm very proud that that thing is still going. It's based on a pretty simple technology for stabilizing soil structure. Basically what we did was to synthesize a natural process. At the microbial level, what makes good soil structure, and good soil structure is that nice crumbly texture with stable aggregates and open spaces in between where air and water can move freely, and it's ideal for plant growth. That happens when organic matter is broken down, metabolized, and finally at the microscopic level, as microbes consume and digest organic matter, what comes out the other end, little micro poop, is a polyelectrolyte, a long chain molecule with a number of charged sites that will attach to the charged clay particles and hold these aggregates stable. It's a wonderful natural process. It works really well when there's plenty of organic matter, there's plenty of water, rain, and the soil is undisturbed. As soon as you start farming, you disturb that cycle, and it's really hard to get it back, except with a whole lot of organic matter. But the problem we have is in Western soils, we only have about 2% organic matter naturally occurring. You really need 20%. To increase the organic matter of the soil by 1% takes about 20 tons of input per acre, and you just got to keep doing that. So we set about to synthesize that process. We basically designed a bigger, better molecule. So we designed a synthetic organic polyelectrolyte that is larger and more stable in the environment and can create all of the magical miracles that perfect soil structure can create. Turns out, too many magical miracles sounds a little, so we had to learn that we couldn't sell one miracle product because great soil structure will increase yields, decrease water usage, make plants that are less susceptible to pests and disease because they're stronger, needing fewer inputs. It reduces runoff of soil and such. So it's a wonderful thing, but we realized we had to parcel that out into one product for each of those benefits for it to not seem so crazy. So, but that's an example of identifying a problem, understanding how it was caused, finding a solution, solutions that don't come out of nowhere but are based on some prior knowledge, and that's how these things are going to move forward. Now, without a vision, the people perish. We've heard that before. So let me give you another example of where a lack of innovation results in disaster. So I did a lot of work in my soil stabilizing days with folks over in Hawaii. Hawaii's agriculture industry was two things, as you know, sugarcane and pineapple. And those industries had been around for 150 years, more, 200 years, 150 years, without changing hardly at all. Very frustrating group of people to work with. I remember one time I sat down, we were working with them to solve a problem. They were trying to take water from the sugar mill and use it to irrigate with through a drip irrigation system, which is a terrible idea because it's basically like irrigating with molasses, and you can't put molasses through a drip system. Just go ahead and, that's like a free one for tonight because you're going to go home and try that. Don't, it doesn't work. So we were solving that problem with them, and they had a chief agronomist on staff, PhD guy, really smart guy, with a big chip on his shoulder, probably because he was working at a sugar company and not a university, but we won't go into that. But he did have an attitude, and I was trying to bring to him the results of what we had done, and I had my agronomist with me, and all of a sudden it became like dueling agronomists, like my agronomist can beat up your agronomist, and it's like, guys. And the agronomist at HCNS, Hawaiian Commercial Sugar Company, in the course of this meeting said this. The man is an agronomist. He said, in my entire career, I've never seen a single agronomic input that makes a damn bit of difference in sugarcane production. And I thought, but didn't say, then how is it that you have this job? You're an agronomist who just told me that agronomic inputs don't matter in sugar production. And last year, they were the last sugar company standing in the state of Hawaii, and they are gone. They could not figure out how to innovate. They knew everything there was to know about sugar production. All of them had been in it their whole life. Their dad was in it. Their grandfather was in it. Nobody knows more about producing sugar than we do. And by the way, no agronomic inputs make any difference in sugar production, and they're gone. So that's exactly what the lack of agricultural innovation looks like. Same thing happened to the pineapple industry. They're basically gone as well. Now, innovation isn't only or even primarily technology, but who doesn't love a cool gizmo, right? So there is a tremendous amount of cool research and development being done around, well, every aspect of food production. This just happens to be a romaine lettuce harvester, which is one of those things nobody ever thought you could do with a machine and not wreck the plants. It's awesome. These are friends of ours. I won't get into it, but it's like a water slicer so that it's all super sterile and everything. There's no blades. It's like a jet of water that slices the thing and it grabs it and it peels off the external leaves, and I know, right? That's cool. This is like Jetsons stuff, you know? And we all love that. But the thing of it is that to feed another 2.5 billion people, we're going to need innovations in nutrition, transportation, resource management, energy, and labor, just to name a few. We've got to look at all, like I said with the boat, you've got to find the most limiting factor in this situation. There's several of them, and we've got to go after each one. So everything from the stuff that we did in the Green Revolution that's still going on, plant breeding, tremendously important. Of course, we've now moved our capacity, our expertise around plant breeding into the genetics age, and once again, we have ethical issues there, or certain issues around the fear of safety of those kind of items. It's interesting to me, just a little aside, science, for everybody who's not a scientist, is a faith-based system. It's like, you know, which religion are you, which scientist? But the funny thing to me is how, for non-scientists, it all becomes really political. People jump into political camps over what science they think is real science and what science they think is junk science. And it's weird how people flip from the real science to junk science side based on whether it's something they agree with politically or not, right? So smart people would say that climate change is pretty well understood to be a fact, right? But some of those same people would say are some of the same people who are very afraid of things like genetically modified food or vaccines, right? So it's like, back to knowledge is really, really important. But around all of these things, so plant breeding, soil, irrigation technologies, everything that happens in the field, mechanization, robotics, that's an interesting one. There's an ethical issue there. Some of these things have two sides. Labor. This is a political problem. This gets into immigration reform, but it also gets into mechanization, robotics, replacing jobs, eliminating jobs. And then as we start eliminating jobs from the economy, where do those people go, and how do we feed people who don't have jobs? And that's part of the equation too, is, you know, this all gets very complicated and interconnected, but there's a tremendous amount of innovation. And like I said, each challenge creates or represents opportunities. There's endless opportunity for innovation in every aspect of getting food produced and into the bellies of the people who need it. One thing I didn't put up here is politics. Sadly, an awful lot of hunger has to do with politics more than it does science. There's a whole lot of people in the world who are hungry who have no reason why that should be the case, other than the political environment that they unfortunately live in. And that's true here. You know, in the United States, you've probably all heard this number, 40% of the food that we produce doesn't get consumed. There's a whole lot of reasons for that along the food chain, but there are people here in a place where we have more than enough food to go around. It's just not going around to everybody who needs it. So in the city of Los Angeles, there's 1.5 million people who don't always know where their next meal is coming from. There's plenty of food, but it's not getting to these folks. Largely, that's an economic issue. Now we're back to labor, jobs, and so on. So these things are complicated, they're interconnected, but each one of these issues, each one of these connecting points creates an opportunity for innovation. Success leaves clues, said some smart person who I don't recall, but it's true. I'll just tell you a quick story. This is you probably see Trader Joe's stuff. So I had the privilege, I met Trader Joe Colomb, through a mutual friend years ago. Super nice guy. I was young, still early in my career, and so I glommed on to Joe, and he was a really nice guy. So he was long retired, and for the price of lunch, I could pick his brain. And it was awesome. And he told me this great story. I won't tell you the whole story, but he said, Trader Joe's came about because of the invention of the 747. Okay, Joe, explain that. So he actually, you may not know this, he invented the whole mini market concept, pronto markets. And then 7-Eleven came along, he sold the business and invented Trader Joe's, which he said was because of the 747, because of the 747, travel became cheap, and a lot of people, while they were in college, would travel to Europe or other places and have experiences and eat food and have things that they came back and couldn't afford because these are a lot of well-educated people who went into academia or whatnot. And so he said that Trader Joe's target market was what he called the overeducated and underemployed, or underpaid. Teachers, librarians, smart people who got a liberal arts degree, traveled some, but can't afford the stuff that they... So he invented Trader Joe's. He would go around and buy, how it was in the old days, he'd buy stuff, and then there's all these weird European products that would be in and out of Trader Joe's. Well, then he sold the company and thought that the guys who bought it were even bigger geniuses than he was, because one of the things he said that he could never figure out was produce at Trader Joe's. Just couldn't figure out how to make it work in that situation. And the new guys came in and figured out what the consumer wanted was packaged produce. So you can buy a clamshell full of strawberries, you can buy a bag of carrots, you can buy a bag of salad, and all of a sudden it became this huge thing at Trader Joe's. So Joe Colomb was probably the most creative, innovative business person I've had the pleasure of hanging out with. Innovations like iPhones often, however, only benefit those who can afford them. And that's a problem when we get to food. Some of our current food trends are just simply unaffordable for those at the bottom. We have a lot of very friendly sounding adjectives that we've attached to our food that make it feel better to us. Things like local, sustainable, organic, biodynamic, heirloom, artisanal, things that make us feel really good about that. But the challenge is, and I work with a lot of folks in the food justice world in LA whose idea of food justice is largely how I feel about the safety and healthfulness of the food that I eat that's available to me and my family. And what gets lost in the equation is people who don't have enough money to put enough food on the table and don't necessarily live in a neighborhood where fresh food, fresh produce is terribly available or at all affordable. And as we look at some of these new and different and exciting ways to approach food production, because we can, we have to keep in mind that if we decide we're going to mandate that for the whole food system, what we're going to end up doing is making food less accessible and less affordable to the people who are already struggling. So it's wonderful that we live in such a time of abundance that we can have all of these options in the food system. But as I was saying a few slides ago, this gets back to that knowledge thing. People like to rail against the windmill of the big bad boogeyman of industrial agriculture or whatever ugly, intentionally offensive sounding adjective we put towards it, that system that was developed during the Green Revolution is ruining everything, and so we need to rail against it, and some of that has to do with these different kinds of approaches to production, but without understanding how we got here, where we came from, and the full complexities of the food system, and more importantly, the people who, all of us, who benefit from it, and where we land in it, it's going to be challenging getting to these solutions. And some of these ethics, some of the ethics of some of the food trends are at odds with one another. Just a couple of examples. So organic production versus food waste. Like I said, 40% of the food doesn't get consumed. It has been going to landfills. Some municipalities like LA are changing that. No more organic waste in the landfills. You're going to have to do something with that waste stream. But organic farming, by its very nature, creates waste. Because you're not using crop protection tools, pesticides, herbicides, those kinds of things, and or commercial fertilizer and so on, crop yields are lower, and without crop protection tools, you have to be prepared for a sudden infestation of pests or disease, and you can lose an entire field. So in order to maintain your position in the marketplace, you have to overplant. So you've got to be using more land, more water, and produce more food that you know is going to waste, because there's only going to be a certain percentage of this that will actually be acceptable to the customer. So these two, the ethics around these two things, both admirable, are inherently in conflict. How do we resolve that in the battle of ethics? What is the primary ethic? And largely, sometimes it becomes sort of the planet or poor people. And so part of agricultural innovation going forward is to remove that dichotomy, remove that choice. We shouldn't have to choose between the health of our planet and the health of our neighbors, right? Local versus climate. Well, short version, greenhouse gases come out of tailpipes. Locally produced food, there's a lot more tailpipes running up and down the street, and small pickups running up and down the street versus, a semi-load or a rail car, and how much greenhouse gas on a per pound basis of product, or you might actually look at it this way, calories worth of nutrition, how much greenhouse gas per unit of nutrition is involved in local production versus concentrated production elsewhere. So this stuff's complicated, but again, with everything, with each of these things, with each of these challenges is an opportunity. None of these things are barriers. They're informative as to what we need to be focused on. We can't afford, monetarily or societally, to have people falling through the cracks. It's the world that I work in now, Seeds of Hope. So just interject here. My soil business, I told you I sold that business. That was about that was 9 years ago. And I've on the nonprofit side of farming now, the work that I do with Solutions for Urban Ag, but my primary role is as Executive Director of Seeds of Hope, and I'll get into it a little bit, but really what we do is, I'm an urban farmer, we grow food in low-income communities for distribution in those communities. And that's part of the agricultural innovation that's necessary. If we've got people falling through the cracks because all of our technological advances are making food more expensive, how then will we address those who don't now have affordable access because that access has passed them by? We have to, because you can't have people falling through the cracks. That's how you get war, famine, revolution, upheaval. We have to, going forward, make sure everybody's got a belly full and has some economic opportunity. Universal, affordable access to basic nutrition. That is how we define food justice at Seeds of Hope, and that is our mission, to try to get to that spot. That is sadly not true for everybody in our communities here in Southern California or anywhere across the country. But to me, that's a North Star kind of navigational statement. That's where we ought to get to, and that's what agricultural innovation should be focused on, is making sure everybody has affordable access to basic nutrition. And sadly, we're at a time in our history where the words food and nutrition are no longer synonyms. So we very intentionally use the word nutrition. There's a lot of consumable, edible calories that don't equal nutrition. It's more, of a recreational activity. But we have a different kind of malnutrition in our, in the developed world at this point in time, where we're basically overfed and undernourished. And I have a good friend who I work with closely at City of Hope, who's a research endocrinologist, and he deals with metabolic disorders. And he's explained to me that obesity and starvation are two sides of the exact same coin. They both are malnutrition. They just present differently based on the set of causes. Yes?
Question. Who or what is driving this concept of organic versus yield waste? A few years ago, organic was practically unheard of.
Right.
But now the marketing is that, you must get organic.
Mm-hmm.
But who is marketing that? Who's gaining?
The organic growers. So That's an excellent question. That one's, I want to talk about that. Let me get through this and then let's get back to it, because that's a really good question. But the preview to the answer is, okay. So, what kind of innovation will it take to bring this about? And the answer is all that we can with all that we already have. That is the model by which we do our work at Seeds of Hope. It's amazing how much we can do with what we already have. It's shocking, really. Years ago, I went out to talk to a church group in Highland Park, the Highland Park neighborhood of LA, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a low-income, high-crime neighborhood. Nobody has anything. It's pretty tough, and they wanted to help their neighbors. So we were sitting around talking about what they could do, and they started coming up with ideas. They could do a community garden. They could do this. They could do that. But I quickly recognized that with each idea that came up, it was immediately followed with a yeah, but we don't have this, or we can't do that, and it was very self-limiting. And I stopped the conversation. I said, guys, look, the whole world is full of stuff, almost all of which you don't have. It's not your stuff. There's no point making a list of what you don't have, because that's nearly everything, and you can't do anything with what you don't have. Let's make a list of what you do have, what you have to work with, and when it's not a lot, then that's easier. It's a shorter list. But that's all we have to work with is what we have. So the challenge for each of us is to do all that we can with what we already have. And the thing about abundance sometimes creates an illusion of scarcity. The thing about scarcity is that when you're focused on it, you don't recognize the abundance around you. Now, scarcity is a real thing. If you don't know how to pay the light bill or you don't know how to pay your rent, you need to pay attention to that. So it calls attention. But there's so much that we already have that we can work with, even people who don't feel like they have a whole lot. It's crazy. And abundance, what's really crazy is people who have plenty who constantly feel like they don't have enough. This sense of scarcity. When we just take a break, just a tiny break from the focus on scarcity, real or imagined, and do the exercise of identifying, once we've identified a problem that we think we need to solve, identifying what we have to bring to the table, okay? We look at the food landscape in LA, and I recognize some injustices and set about to try to do what we could. When we look at the landscape of the food landscape in LA and we identify the problems and we look back at ourselves and say, well, can we solve that problem? Our answer is, well, of course not. But the fact that we can't solve it doesn't absolve us from doing what we can do. Each of us has something that we can do. Each of us has a capacity. Each of us has some way to plug into this process. I created, from just simplicity in my own way of thinking, of this equation that says need plus capacity equals responsibility. If I look into the community and identify a pressing need, and I look back, in my direction and identify some capacity that I have to address that need, then in that intersecting point is my responsibility. I can't see it, recognize I could do something about it, and walk away from it. And here's the thing, sometimes we already have everything we need. And if we don't have it, somebody else does have it. And that's the power of collaboration. Identifying a need, identifying capacity, identifying the capacity we lack, and identifying somebody else who has that capacity, and then we pull it all together. So is urban ag part of the solution? This is one of our places. It's actually in Hollywood. That used to be an alleyway that was full of drug dealers and prostitutes and all sorts of awful activity. And so, long story, but the city ended up deeding the alleyway to us. We fenced it, took out the asphalt, completely changed it, and created a little micro farm there. Here's where I see the role of urban agriculture as one small role in this equation, and the work that we do at Seeds of Hope. Seeds of Hope, by the way, I didn't give you the whole story. Seeds of Hope is the food justice ministry of the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. You saw our definition of food justice, universal affordable access to basic nutrition. The thing came about, the bishop of the diocese at the time is a good friend of mine. Obviously, as my good friend, knows my whole lifetime in agriculture and some other things that I've done around this food issue. And he nearly died of cancer. He had leukemia. Everybody thought he was going to die. Long story, he went to City of Hope and he's not dead. So that was the good part. And then because he wasn't dead, he said, hey, I told you I had a friend who's an endocrinologist, City of Hope. Totally by accident, those two guys ended up seeing each other because Dr. Samoa was doing rounds, whatever. They ended up in a conversation 2 hours. I don't know what happened to the other patients that day. But by the time they were done, Bishop Bruno was really aware of and concerned about the health issues in our community due to poor nutrition, due to lack of food access, and somehow Dr. Samoa had become an Episcopalian, all in the space of 2 hours. But so he called me up. You won't believe who I met. They both did. You're not going to believe who I met yesterday. It's crazy. And he said, when I get out of the hospital, I want to do something in the diocese with gardens or something. So he got out. This was like the end of, I remember this because it was the end of November of 2012. And we went to breakfast. I thought we'd have a brainstorming conversation. He looks at me and goes, I want to start in January. I'm like, start what in January? He decided I'd figure that out. So I came back to him with a plan I pitched him called Farm the Diocese. And that was, I said, here's the thing. The diocese has 210 institutions, most of them churches and schools and things like that. And so the one thing they all have in common is they have a physical location, which means I can turn that into a farm. I can turn that into a vertically integrated food system and look at this as a bunch of network of little mini farms. And they have facilities where we can distribute food, food pantries, meal programs. And there were spots around the diocese that were doing that already. And I said, let's just never mind whatever cool churchy stuff they do inside the church. I can farm the outside. And it grew from there, and it's become now integrated with, we're working on housing projects for homeless within our farms, converting, adaptive reuse is what they call it. And growing food in the community, with the community that's suffering from this lack of affordable access, changes the landscape powerfully for folks who have fallen through the cracks as we are developing more and more pricey technologies that make food pricier and pricier. And this is a great opportunity beyond just giving people free food at a food pantry, which we do, but to go beyond that, a couple things, turning some of this into commercial businesses that allow us to create jobs so people can go buy their own food, which is a much bigger dignity piece, but also teaching people how to grow their own food and where they lack the space, giving them the space to grow it themselves, which changes the equation entirely. Instead of, please, may I have some food, it's, I'm going to grow food for my family. It can dramatically stretch their food budget dollar because it's so much cheaper to grow it, especially if we're providing the land and the water. And they're even able to contribute back some of the produce they've grown to help others who are in need of coming to the food pantry. So a lot of the solutions, a lot of the technology that we're working on developing, both at Seeds of Hope and at Solutions for Urban Ag, are around new technologies for urban production. We're not getting heavily into, certainly not at Seeds of Hope, any of the cool sort of indoor controlled climate agriculture stuff. It's neat. I mean, it's really cool. It's fun to tour those places. But they're limited in what they can produce. They're super expensive. The energy needs are crazy. That technology is a long way down the line. But there's a lot of cool technologies that we are developing and testing and trying in these environments, really for the sake of the folks that would otherwise fall through the cracks. And now comes the conversation part of this, which I always prefer to a monologue.